Those of you who don't know, I have doctorates in chemistry and in computer and information science. And today we're going to be looking at transitional forms. What does the evidence actually say? And to talk about transitional forms, we need to talk a little bit about biological evolution, which in the broadest sense means descent with modification. And microevolution, everybody that I know of agrees that's a proven fact that things change over time. The other one is called macroevolution, descent of all species from a common ancestor, and that has never been observed, but 77% of the people, in the US at least, accept that as fact. And the couple interesting quotes. All our data suggests that small-scale evolution cannot produce the sort of large-scale change that Darwinism requires.
Sorry to interrupt. They said they can turn it down a little bit, but they can't directly do that because it's going to make it the side. So they'll get it down as much as they can, but they got to do it on, I guess, for the restaurants.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll speak loudly, see if I can overpower it.
Or you could just ignore it.
Or could everybody ignore it.
Thank you.
We have background music. The central question, whether the mechanisms underlying microevolution can be extrapolated to explain the phenomenon of macroevolution, the answer can be given as a clear no. But yet it's accepted as, to most biologists, for example, and most people, they think there is no such thing as the difference between micro and macro. It's just, they're all the same. Well, they're not. Anyway. Neo-Darwinian biology says each successive change in the gradual evolutionary process was simple enough relative to its predecessor to have arisen by chance. That's what Richard Dawkins says. Charles Darwin said in his book, Origin of Species, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. So you can remember that for a little later. We conclude unexpectedly that there is little evidence for the neo-Darwinian view. Its theoretical foundations and the experimental evidence supporting it are weak, so says Warren Point. The failure to observe even one mutation that adds information is more than just a failure to support the theory. It is evidence against the neo-Darwinian theory. There has never been a documented case where a random mutation has added functional information ever. So keep that in mind. Transitional fossils. Darwin said, so that the number of intermediate and transitional links between all living and extinct species must have been inconceivably great. But assuredly, if this theory is true, such have lived upon the earth, then why is not every geological formation and every strata full of such intermediate links? That's what Darwin said. He couldn't find them, but he assumed they would be found eventually. And we'll look at that today. Evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them. There have been millions of fossils from exploration of different kinds, not only exploration looking for fossils, but exploration like oil well drilling and coal mining and other kinds of things. And there have been no verified transitional fossils found. And millions of fossils have been found. A very interesting picture that is the biological tree of life. That supposedly the initial formation of life occurred way back here, and then it split off, and each of those split off into other things. until we finally get to the recent conditions here. And what I find very, very intriguing about this figure is that the black portions of this are fossils that have been found. The ones that are not black are the presumed path to them. Notice anything that's rather interesting about that? When an organism is found, either it goes extinct like these, or it continues to the present day. There's none found on the transitions. But yet this is represented as the biological tree of life. Interesting. So in any case, most of the animal phyla that are represented in the fossil record first appeared fully formed in the Cambrian. That's the lowest fossil strata that contains fossils. The fossil record is therefore of no help with respect to the origin and early diversification of the various animal phyla. So say people in their book, The Invertebrates. Richard Dawkins, a very friendly person, to creationists and ID people, said concerning the invertebrates, it's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. The fossil record fails to support evolution with a multitude of life in the very oldest fossil-bearing rocks and a fixity of the species over eons of time, and there have been no verified transitional forms found, although many have been claimed. For example, the Tiktaalik, we'll talk about that fish that was supposedly the intermediate form between fish and amphibians, tetrapods. In the book, or videotape rather, it's a 2-hour video that's still online. What Darwin never knew, except for a very minor gene mutation for mouse coloration, all of the evolutionary evidence that's presented involved turning for existing genes on or off. So no new information was ever formed in that whole 2-hour video. It only talked about turning existing genes on or off to make the changes. And they found one that I'll show a video clip, but I'll have to narrate it because we don't have sound, of the perfect transitional form. It was declared to be, they were looking for the transition between fish and tetrapods. That's 4-limbed creatures. And they found exactly where they were expecting to find it, and they identified it as the transitional form between fish and tetrapods. And it was called the perfect transitional form. And that, in the video, it says it proves evolution. Because they were looking for it, they found it, that proves evolution. Because the genes that are needed to make arms and legs were already being carried around by this prehistoric fish. But a couple of years later, a tetrapod that was dated 10 million years older than the Tiktaalik was found, and it was a fully formed tetrapod. And that was published in Nature. So the idea that the Tiktaalik was a transition between fish and tetrapods was proven not to be true, but the video is still online. And it's still proclaimed to be a transitional form. So just because something is claimed to be a transitional form, that doesn't mean it is. So anyway, here's but the information that's presented in the video, you could actually conclude that the first life was created with all of the genes that would ever be needed by any life, and that all that was needed was the switching those genes on or off, and which is against what evolution teaches, against what lots of things teach. But anyway, the video then, here's the video, and that's the fish that has scales. That's not a fish, but this fish has scales, so it is a fish, but it has things that are very unusual for a fish, because it also has the arm-like fin, or maybe it's a fin-like arm, but in any case, the Tiktaalik was supposedly the transition between fish and the tetrapods that walked on land. And like I said, a older, fully formed tetrapod was found after Tiktaalik was declared to be the transitional form that predated the Tiktaalik by a long period of time. Another interesting one in this particular picture is the coelacanth. The coelacanth is a fish that was presumed to be extinct 70 million years ago. And anything with the coelacanth fossil in it was dated at 70 million years, because that's when coelacanths lived. And that continued for many times. So you can date rocks of that age. If they have a coelacanth fossil in it, they're 70 million years old. And that was fine until 1939, when they caught a live coelacanth off the coast of Madagascar. And they had to kind of revise that a bit. Archaeopteryx supposedly is a transitional form between birds and reptiles. Reptile rather to birds. So sometimes that's referred to dinosaur to bird transition. It has a full set of teeth, which most birds don't have. A rather flat breastbone, a long bony tail. It has belly ribs and 3 claws on the wings, and most birds don't have that. And but yet it had modern feathers, it had wings, it has a wishbone, and it had fingers. One of the problems that it has as being a transition is that a modern bird that was dated 60 million years older than the Archaeopteryx has been found and documented in Science News, for example, in 1977. But if you looked at just the skull, for example, you say, well, that's not a bird, that's a reptile or something. But and it's still being claimed that that's a transitional form, even though older, fully formed birds have been found. Yeah.
John, do you have any information on how they choose to initially base the dates of a one? For example, you said they found the one was 70 million years. How did they initially get that first one and say that was 70, or this one here that the first bird was 60 million before this thing?
There's lots of different ways of dating. One of them is through the use of index fossils. The other one is various kinds of radioactive decay and things like that. We won't get into all the different dating methods here, but those are the standard dates that are accepted by basically most scientists. And so the fully formed bird, for example, was dated by the normal way of dating, and they determined that it was much older. Okay? I'm not going to get into all the dating.
Got it. No, I just asked if there was a general thing.
But reptiles, sometimes they're called dinosaur to birds transitions. And like dinosaurs supposedly lived, millions of years before man ever came along. But there's all kinds of really interesting artifacts in cave drawings. These are the Tiktaalik National Park petrographs that have these dinosaurs, and they very closely are resembling the Brachiosaurus that modern people who figure out what they might have looked like, and they match, which is kind of interesting. Several other ones. There's a Grand Canyon National Park petrograph on the left, and an artist's depiction of the Montosaurus on the right, and they look fairly similar. And my question to people would be, well, if dinosaurs went extinct long before human beings came along, how did those human beings know what they looked like? So that they might be transitional forms between something else, I think leaves a little bit to be desired. There's a good transitional form, platypus. Very interesting animal. When it was first discovered, it was dismissed as a hoax. Because, no, you can't have that. You have this mammal that lays eggs. And it's a mammal, it has mammary glands, but it doesn't have any nipples. The milk is oozed out onto the breast of the platypus, and the baby platypi lick it off. Anyway, males have venomous spurs. They don't have any stomach, and they have a single opening that's used for take care of all the bodily functions, for getting sexual reproduction, and both the insemination and the birth. And one opening does it all. Efficient. Anyway, is that a transitional form? I don't know of any scientist who says that's a transitional form to anything. I mean, it has a bill, like a duck, called the duck-billed platypus. It has webbed feet, like birds, like a duck. It lays eggs like a duck. Oh, what is it?
A duck.
A duck. Yeah, it acts like a duck. It sounds like a... Yeah. I don't know of any scientist who would classify this as a transitional form. It's just very different from traditional mammals. Very different. And so, to then go back to the archaeopteryx and other things that have teeth and other things, well, so what? What difference does that make? Point to this thing here and say, that's not a transitional form. Why would you make the archaeopteryx?
So what's the closest transitional forms they claim?
They don't claim. They don't claim this to be a transitional form.
Right, but I'm saying they must have an ancestor somewhere.
Well, I don't know because,
In the fossils.
I don't know where they, I have not really seen anything definitive as to where they think this thing came from.
So in the diagram, there probably was nothing, no connection in that little diagram above.
Probably, no, yeah.
In the
And
fossils.
in the diagram, I don't know where they would classify this thing. But anyway, it's an interesting concept, and you can always point to the platypus as something that certainly looks like a transitional form, if there was such a thing. And it is not acknowledged by any scientist that I know of as a transitional form.
It's been horizontal gene transfer.
Sounds like a good dissertation topic for us.
Anyway. But in the very lowest level of fossils, you find some very interesting life forms, including my favorite, the trilobite. What makes the trilobite really interesting is the eyes of the trilobite. The trilobite eye has focusing material made out of calcium carbonate. It's inorganic, and apparently these prehistoric things that lived supposedly 50 million years ago knew all the laws of physics when it comes to optics, and could design these things that were really quite amazing. And in fact, these lenses optimize both light collecting and image formation better than any lens that optical physics has ever been able to formulate. Isn't that an interesting statement? These animals that were in the very lowest fossil level had more knowledge about how to make eye lenses than modern physicists can do when they're manufacturing the most optimized eye lenses. And what's really interesting is that these lenses, because they're inorganic, they don't decompose like the normal lenses of normal animals would. And so physicists can actually do the optical measurements on the real lenses. They don't have to guess what the optical properties are. They can measure them. And that's a very interesting concept. It has been said the design of the trilobites eye lens could well qualify for a patent disclosure. And there's no predecessor in the fossil record of these things because they appear in the very lowest level of rock, the fossilized rock. There's nowhere that they know that they came from. They just suddenly appear with these perfectly designed eye lenses. And the only other animal that we know of that uses inorganic material to focus light is people with glasses. Another one that's very interesting is the single-cell bacterium. And you probably all have seen this kind of picture before. The bacteria flagellum, it really is irreducibly complex. It's made up of at least 48 proteins, of which 30 are completely unique to the flagellum. And every protein that is used and manufactured in the human body is actually the output of the execution of a real computer program. I mentioned that in my book, Programming of Life. Every single protein is the output of a real computer program. And it's processed by the biological computers to make proteins. Anyway, this thing here rotates at about 100,000 revolutions per minute. It's an electric motor, has all the components of a normal electric motor, has rotor and stator and bushings and all kinds of other things. And it's used to power this bacterium as it goes through liquid in search of the next meal or the next victim. And well, anyway, but what's really interesting is each of the 48 proteins is an output of a real computer program. If you take all of them, take any one of those proteins out of this thing and it doesn't work at all. So you cannot build it up little by little. And Darwin said if you can find something that cannot be produced by slight modifications of what preceded it, his theory would absolutely break down. This breaks down Darwin's theory, totally. Because take any one of those proteins away, the thing doesn't work at all. It has no functionality. It would not survive. And the probability of forming then all 30 proteins, for example, at once, because take any one of them away and the thing doesn't work, you need all 48 for it to work. What's the probability of forming them all? Well, that's 1 chance in 10 to the 5,250. Not real likely to happen. So anyway, that's another one of my favorite examples of that. And we have a lot of talk about hominids and the intermediates between man and apes and man. But just earlier this year, we still have not found the missing link between us and apes. Scientists have been on the trail of the last common ancestor for decades, and they still have not found it. For example, Nebraska man here, this nice figure here, was based on a single tooth. And it turned out to be the tooth of an extinct pig. But yet they can draw this really nice picture of the man and his wife around the fire and all kinds of things. Piltdown man, here's Piltdown man, was based on a human skull and an orangutan jaw, and it was fabricated as a hoax, and to be. They were looking for a missing link. They found it. The guy who made this, Dawson, fabricated the human skull with an orangutan jaw and said, that's Piltdown man, and said he found it near Piltdown, England. Then we have Java man, which turns out to be the skull cap is that of an ape, and they found a human leg 30 feet away, and the guy who found it put those two together and said, that's a new hominid, intermediate between ape and man. Then there's Neanderthal. Now Neanderthal, I mean, that looks quite a bit like a modern human being. In fact, it has been shown that Neanderthals and the Homo sapiens later, the fully ones that are acknowledged as being human, they interbred with one another, so they are fully human. They're the same species, that because they can interbreed. That makes them part of the same species. But anyway, he doesn't look all that foreign as opposed to this one here. Or perhaps his forehead is a little more than new, but we have a lot of people that have different facial structures. But anyway, it got to be so that people were looking for the missing link, and they would do almost anything to find it. And whenever they found something that they could pass off as a missing link, that's what it became. Another really interesting one is based on the Laetoli footprints. In Laetoli, Africa, there's a plain in basically volcanic ash that was dated at 3.7 million years old. And one of the things on the PBS program described it, they look so human-like, some scientists had a hard time believing they were made by Lucy's species, the only human ancestor known to have lived at that time. Now, I went to the British Museum of Natural History, and they had this model of these ape-like hairy creatures that were there, and it showed the footprints that they left as they walked along. But what's interesting is the footprints of these hairy ape-like creatures are indistinguishable from those of modern humans. Indistinguishable. So obviously feet evolved first, because the footprints that are left by these creatures are indistinguishable from those of modern man. So why do they draw them with lots of hair and everything else on their bodies? Well, because they're dated 3.7 million years old, and human beings didn't live back then. So they had to be ape-like creatures. More recently, this year, in fact, in last year, they were just first discovered a species of tiny human beings that were about 3 feet tall were discovered on the Indonesian island of Flores. They were known as the Hobbits, and they were miniature people. So there are lots of miniature people. There are, a lot of pygmies in Africa and Indonesia and Australia and other places. And similarly, the Homo naledi is one of the most astonishing hominin fossils in recent years, on par with the Hobbits. And in the article I read, it says if they were on the order of 2 million years, they would be considered possibly transitional, but not if they're much younger. Well, we now know the answer is out, they're young. So they are not transitional, though many people thought they were. So, anyway, these are some of the transitional forms that have been examined and realized that they really aren't. And a little different line, some of the things that show supposedly transition from one type of organism to another are the development of the nylon digesting bacterium. Nylon was invented in 1935, and so they discovered in a nylon producing plant in Japan that some of the bacteria there developed the ability to digest nylon. And since nylon hadn't been invented until 1935, they obviously evolved the capability to do that. But as it And the claim is that new information can evolve quickly. But it has been found that a new protein that already has a low-level activity, which normal bacteria can digest nylon, just not at a very high rate. They already have the capability to do it, it's just that it's not common because they don't have to. Why would you want to spend all the energy it takes to digest nylon if you have cellulose around and you can easily get your fill on it? And so anyway, there are many cases in the literature where a pre-existing trait can be accentuated relatively easily so that you can depend on a new diet. And so the bacteria that digest nylon do so with only about an 8% efficiency. And basically they can no longer digest their normal diet of cellulose. And so they have actually lost quite a bit of functional information in the process of getting the new capabilities. And again, they actually had the capabilities before, just that they weren't used. Just like if you are put into a new environment, for example, a human being can adjust to a lot of different environments, and once they do, you lose a lot of the capabilities you had before, and at least until you require them again. And then it would go back again because the genetic code is somewhat flexible. You can add and subtract capabilities. Richard Lewontin makes a very interesting statement. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to the understanding the real struggle between the science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, and in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a commitment to materialism. Materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. That's what's called science. Blocking out anything other than naturalistic materialism. Anything else is not science. Well, in his view, at least, because we have a commitment to materialism. Materialism is absolute. There is no other thing other than materialism. But Darwinism now is doubted by thousands of scientists, and that is really encouraging because it's been a long time coming. Karl Popper, for example, said that Darwinism is not a testable scientific theory, but a metaphysical research program. And natural selection is not a mechanism, it's the process by which the results of evolution are sorted. Stop and think about it. They say natural selection is the mechanism for evolution. It is. It cannot be. Evolution supposedly takes place when the genetic code is modified. A pre-existing organism has no capability of modifying its genetic code. There is no mechanism for doing that. Therefore, natural selection is not a mechanism for evolution. All it does is determine who's going to reproduce. Stunningly, information has been shown not to increase in the coding regions of DNA with evolution. Mutations do not produce any increased information. The amount of coding in DNA actually decreases with evolution. We must concede there are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of evolution of any biochemical or cellular activity, only a variety of wishful speculations. So says Harold in The Way of the Cell. what I've said in my books, for example, is Darwinism says that you can take an existing organism, and I show in my books, for example, that the DNA is simply computer programs, and what it says is you can modify existing computer programs to sometimes produce better computer programs. And I can say as a computer scientist that has never shown to be possible. But one of the replacements that is being portrayed is the extended synthesis. The number of biologists calling for a change in how evolution is conceptualized is growing rapidly. A rising number of publications argue for a major revision or even replacement of the standard theory of evolution. And I say, yay! That indicating that this cannot be dismissed as a minority view, but as rather widespread feeling among scientists and philosophers alike. And I think this is a very healthy thing to happen, that more and more scientists are rejecting Darwinism as being unworkable. It does not work, and it's been shown not to work over and over again. And finally, science is acknowledging that. One of the examples of what's in the extended synthesis is evolution by natural genetic engineering. Genetic engineering says we can take the DNA and we can engineer it to produce the qualities that we want. That's genetic engineering. Natural genetic engineering, one of the traditional objections to Darwinian gradualism has been that it is too slow and indeterminate a process to account for natural adaptations, even allowing for long periods of random mutation and selection. Natural genetic engineering employs a combinatorial search process based upon DNA modules that already possess functionality. In computer science, a combinatorial search means I'm going to try every possible combination until I find one that works, and I'll choose that as the one that's best. And so what natural genetic engineering says, the cell can not do random mutations. It will determine if I mutate this way, this will be the result. If I mutate that way, that will be the result. And I can choose the way that I mutate to give me the best results. I will do a combinatorial search on all the possible mutations, and I can choose the one that produces the best result. Got that? And so what happens then, such a cognitive component is absent from the conventional evolutionary theory. The cell has a mind. It has a cognitive component that can make decisions. It doesn't depend on random mutations. It chooses which way to mutate based on the mind of the cell that can determine what will be the result if I mutate in a particular way. And then it can choose the way to mutate that will produce the best result. Sound interesting? Well, such a cognitive component is missing from conventional evolutionary theory because the 19th and 20th century evolutionists were not sufficiently knowledgeable about cellular response and control networks. Okay, that's the reason. If this worked, that would explain a lot of stuff. If the cell could indeed think and analyze which way should I mutate, and I will mutate in the way that will give me the best result, then evolution could work. I have a couple of questions. One of them is, where's the proof that the cell can do that? Secondly, how did it get that capability? Did that evolve by natural processes somehow? Anyway, so there's lots of unanswered questions, and Shapiro never explains how a cell could get this capability. He just said, well, it must exist because we have evolution, and that's a fact, and this would explain evolution if it happened. Okay. A couple other ones that are interesting. One of them, evolution by horizontal gene transfer, and also by jumping genes. A horizontal gene transfer says the genetic material from one organism can be inserted into the DNA of another organism by transferring the gene from one organism into the gene of another organism. And one of the proponents of that says that how can modern biology have gone so far off track? It's simply a tale of scientific complacency. Biologists were seduced by their own success into thinking they had found the final truth in all evolution. And Carl Woese says that evolution by horizontal gene transfer makes more sense. Yeah.
Now, the reason that happens with virus, right? The virus injects
Yeah.
so, but that never does any good. It just kills
Well, yeah, I'm not saying it can't be done. And what I point out in my book, for example, it does not violate the principles of information, but it does not generate any new information. Therefore, it cannot produce new structures, but it can take existing information and put it into someplace else. Just like I can take the information on my computer here, put it on a flash drive, and put it in a different computer. There's nothing that violates information principles by doing that. But it doesn't generate anything new, which evolution supposedly does. Transposable elements are kind of similar to that, in that transposable elements take a portion of the DNA and transpose it to somewhere else in the same DNA. Okay, so that has been shown to be the case that's possible also. But again, it doesn't generate any new information. All it does is put it in a different spot. That transposable elements supposedly make up about 50% of the human genome, for example. So that there can be a lot of variation within the human genome that's already there. They could just be transposed to somewhere else. Transposable elements. Anyway, so if you look at the conclusions to this short talk here, the fossil record shows sudden appearance of various body structures and then stasis, stays the same without any going from one body form to another. The Darwinism mechanisms have been disproved as not workable, even by many, many scientists. There's still a majority of scientists that hold to it, but thousands are now abandoning Darwinism because they acknowledge it does not and cannot work. But my biggest point is that there's no explanation for life's information and programs. For example, in the flagellum, I talked about every protein is the output of a real computer program. And in my Programming of Life book that I wrote several years ago, I point out the reality of computer programs and hardware and software that's in everything that's alive. So that every more than 100 trillion cells of your body has literally millions of real computers and real computer programs. And they process information. They are used for controlling things, they're used for generating proteins. Everything that makes things biological are dependent on the processing of digital computer programs. And they're digital. And the DNA code is digital. And we all know from the big switch to digital TV that digital is better. And Life knew that from the very beginning. Anyway, you are welcome to go online and view the video that's based on this best-selling book. It's viewable free. It's had over 276,000 online views, and you can do it for free. Most people find it quite interesting. My secular website is scienceintegrity.org. The PDF of this presentation, as well as other ones, are available on there. And if you're Christian, you can go to 4im.org, which is my Christian website, that has links to all kinds of stuff. So I have about 18 or 19 presentations that have been recorded that are online. linkable from my website. Questions? Yeah.
Oh, I can think of a whole bunch of them.
Oh.
The first thing, your basic topic about transitional forms, it raises the question of ancestry, of a connection through ancestry, which is what they are assuming, and you talked about the phylogenetic tree and how it's drawn out. One of the interesting things there is that there are lots of different phylogenetic trees that disagree with each other, depending on which attributes you use to make the tree. You know, are you using a protein, are you using a piece of DNA, are you using a physical attribute
Physical
like
attribute
a
that you
wing
find in
or
the fossil record or whatever,
leg or-
yeah.
Yeah, and so, class I was doing, we were looking at this thing of cladistics,
Yeah,
basically organizing things on a
Yes.
chart.
yeah,
And I found online that there are colleges that teach cladistics in their biology department, and they have their students take nuts and bolts and screws and arrange them on a chart to teach them how to do cladistics, how to make a tree, basically, based on attributes. And it's like, you know, hello, McFly, you just proved that it takes design, because nuts and bolts and screws have no ancestry to each other.
right. Yes. Bingo. Yeah.
Are you sure?
How do you know?
Well, the hottest thing today is birds from dinosaurs. Besides just getting a comment on that, I don't see any of the references when I look at it, the fact that birds have a different genetic structure than all the other mammals. You notice in the humans and other mammals is that the male has the double chromosomes, the XY, the female doesn't. So the female cannot give birth to a male without the male process. But the female birds is the other way around, right? So notice the genetics of a bird is actually inverted from all the other mammals.
Ah, okay.
But anyway, so the point is that you know, what's your comment on you know, birds from dinosaurs? How will we refute that?
How would we refute it?
You've given some evidence
Well, that there are older birds that date the supposed transitional form.
Yeah, but they're saying now there's bird feathers, for example.
Yeah, okay.
It's not, the point is that they're not flying animals any more than a kiwi. So in my mind, if it's got feathers, then it's not a dinosaur.
That makes sense to me, but we have claims made that these were feathered dinosaurs.
Right,
but
but it's now
That's a
considered-
claim. I mean,
Right.
all the transitional forms are claims, that you can make a claim, and what they do is they try to, well, you try to prove that I'm wrong. Well,
Well, yeah, it could be,
That's hard to
and
do.
I think it's more likely, it's just like the Piltdown man, it's the feathers on the dinosaur could be a fraud.
yeah, well, could be. But the Piltdown man was designed to be a fraud, and people bought that for, I don't know, what, 30 or 40 years, as saying that's the intermediate between, you know, men and, you know, hominids and man. And it's hard sometimes to pin things down. And you ask, well, there are thousands of transitional forms. Well, have you really analyzed it and proven that it's a transitional form? Because there are lots of different species of animals that have characteristics that are not found anywhere else, but that doesn't mean they're transitional. Other people will say everything that's alive is a transitional form because they're all evolving to be something later. Well, therefore that makes them a transitional form. So you almost can't win an argument.
They're assuming their conclusion, it's begging the
Oh,
question.
sure.
Because the whole issue is how do you connect that ancestry? It's like
Right.
the platypus is a definite problem, but you could ask the same question of, say, archaeopteryx.
Sure.
You could say, is that the platypus of reptiles? Because if you've got teeth and you've got feathers, how is that different from the platypus problem? You haven't shown ancestry. All you've done is make an assumption.
And even if they can show previous forms of something, that said, well, this one here looks like it evolved from that one. They haven't proven that that is what happened either. So, yeah, it's a real hard argument to win with people who have their mindset on this is the way it is. Yeah.
One argument they use, and I've got my own understanding of what I think the answer is, but I'm interested in your point of view about the commonality of the DNA codes amongst the various species.
Okay. Well, for example, it often is touted as being chimps and humans' DNA code is 95 to 98% the same. And, well, that's kind of a stretch because the protein coding part of the DNA is 95 to 98% the same. But so what? Because chimps and humans process the same kind of material. They say they process the same kinds of food. They have the same kinds of proteins.
Same functionality.
Proteins are, basically, why would you expect, for example, the computer program in a chimp that generates a particular protein to be different than the computer program in a man that generates the same protein? Why would you expect there to be a difference? But if you go away from the protein coding part of the DNA into the what used to be considered junk DNA, then the similarity drops to like 60%, from 95 to 98%, down to 60%. The non-coding part of DNA is very different, but they don't talk about that. They just talk about the protein coding part. It's, oh, the similarity is 95 to 98%. Well, let's look at the whole amount of DNA because it is not junk DNA anyway, because that was proven in 2012 when 30 research papers were organized and came out at the same time that it showed functionality for over 80% of that junk DNA. It is not junk.
And the other thing, if you take two computer programs and you say, oh, they're the same except for the 60%.
Yeah.
Enormous difference.
Yeah. That's true. And, that's what always puzzles me. When my book first came out, a biologist in particular would say, DNA, the things in DNA, those aren't computer programs. Those are just chemicals. And I said, well, my computer's just chemicals too. That's not what makes it a computer. What makes it a computer is that it can take information that's stored in a computer program, process that information, and produce meaningful output. And that's exactly what happens in the human body with the biological computers.
Well, speaking of the problem with computer programs, because we have the same thing at Boeing, when you introduce more changes, you also introduce more errors as well.
Yeah.
And we find at Boeing, it says every software change, 5% of them introduce more errors. So the problem is that, in fact, the conference we went to, doesn't change create errors as well?
Oh, yeah, I would think it would. Plus, the fact that any significant computer science set of programs, involves what's called top-down design. You design the solution from the top down, break it down into smaller and smaller chunks, and you finally put them all together with each chunk working the way it's supposed to get an organized whole that functions properly. And that's the only way that programs of any significance can work. What does evolution say? Evolution works at the very, very lowest level, that random changes at the very, very lowest level produce computer programs that combine to form ever and ever increasing complexity to reach the top level where everything just fits together beautifully.
And they assume none of those little subroutines ever breaks.
Oh, of course. If it did, it would have to evolve to fix it, right? Yeah. So those are some of the problems that I point out in my books, and I pointed out in my peer-reviewed papers that I published, and all kinds of other things. And I have pointed out in peer-reviewed papers that biology is not a physical science like chemistry and physics. biology is an information science because everything that makes it biology is controlled by the processing of digital information. So, anyway, that's, yeah.
In your books, you give us a lot of numbers that you've calculated on the low probability for lots of things in living things. Just incredible numbers. And in this presentation, you gave an example of that with the 30 unique proteins in the flagellum.
Flagellum.
And you said that's like one chance in 10 to the 5,000 something.
5,280.
Yeah, so 5,000 zeros. I don't know if you've read Douglas Axe's book that came out a year ago. It's a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. But he talks about these kind of numbers too, and he calls them fantastically improbable.
Yeah.
And it's this idea that, I mean, when you put a number like that on the board, I think most of us just, we cannot
Can I?
comprehend
We
it.
can't, I mean, there are only 10 to the 80th atoms in the entire universe.
Yeah.
So it's hard to imagine
So
how
5,000
big that
exponents.
number is, 10 to the 80th. Can you imagine how big 10 to the 5,280th is?
No.
Well, I gotta be a devil's advocate here, because reading their books, they'll say that the properties of that flagellum appear in somewhere else, in some other protein, and somehow they magically appeared in the flagellum. In other words, they existed this way.
Co-option.
And it's called co-option, you know. And as if there was some magical device to combine them all. How would you respond to that? Because they say there's no big, they actually quote them,
Oh,
saying it's no big deal.
they'll say that there's no big deal.
Isn't that a snub
And they'll say that the flagellum usurped the proteins in the type 3 secretory system because they share many of the proteins. 18 of the proteins in the flagellum are shared by the type 3 secretory system that bacteria use to inject poisons into their victims. And they say, well, that proves that they just took the type 3 secretory system and took those proteins and put them into the flagellum. Well, how about the other 30? That's why I use that number 30.
Or it could be
because
the other way around.
those are unique.
Simultaneously.
Yeah, simultaneous. Yeah, all 30 simultaneously had to come to be. But the other thing is the phylogenetic analysis of that says that, if anything, the secretory system evolved from the flagellum and not vice versa. So, yeah.
That would make more sense, yeah.
You know, whatever. But it's hard. It's hard to argue with people whose mind is already made up.
It's hard to argue with people who go down and buy lottery tickets too.
Yeah, that's true too. Yes, that's true.
You got a lot better chance of
The lottery is a lot better chance than forming.
I think it's more insidious than that. I think that's the reason why it's a problem. We will go down and buy a lottery ticket because we know we have a chance of winning,
Right.
which is ridiculous.
Well, there is a chance of winning,
You know,
but it's not. That certainly shouldn't be a reason for doing it, because as I point out in my books, the probability of losing is vastly more abundant than the probability of winning.
I have another question, and that's on the origin of life.
Yeah.
I read recently that still, my professors that I'm listening to are saying that life originated in a warm pond. And I mean, and that things combine together, but Heinz and I have seen all the research, doesn't amino acids break down in water?
They do indeed.
And yet he's denying it. I asked him that specifically to my professor. They deny it, that it breaks down in water. Why does it break down in water?
It's hydrolyzed.
Isn't that a basic property?
Well, yeah, the amino acids, like when you take amino acids and you create proteins from them, you have to remove one molecule of water to form the reaction to make a polypeptide, and that can't happen in water.
Well, show me a textbook somewhere that it actually admits it. I can't find one.
It could very well be.
It's in the paper, it's in the research papers, but not in the technical book.
Oh, yeah, okay.
so as a chemist, Do you think that's the biggest issue with the pond scum formation is hydrolysis?
Well, that's one of the problems, but
No, that's not my question. You think
that's the
of
biggest.
all the different, there's a lot of chemical issues.
Right.
Do you think that is, probably stands out as the biggest obstacle to origin of life in a water system? Or the other corollary question, or same question is, what is the biggest problem chemically?
The source of information is the biggest problem. The source of information has never, ever been shown to exist apart from a mind making it happen. How's that?
Oh, there's the other
But that's
problem.
not chemistry.
That's
That's not
genetic,
chemistry.
genetic code is chemistry too.
Well, it's
Because
chemistry.
what is the correlate, have you ever seen him point out that the genetic code, the 64 combinations that make the genetic code are totally unrelated to the amino acids they create? Where does it get that information?
And that's one of the things I point out in my book.
Yeah.
And that's why I point out that the ribosome has to be a computer that sorts through all these things and creates the amino acid, that takes the amino acids and produces the protein, for example, by a design that's in the computer program inside the ribosome. Because there's nothing physicochemically that make that happen, as John pointed out. Nothing,
But my question is
the
related.
codon on one end of the transporting RNA, tRNA, has nothing at all to do with the amino acid on the other end.
You didn't answer my
Oh,
question.
okay.
That's okay.
I didn't let you ask the question.
Well, information aside,
Okay.
because without the process, the physical chemical process,
Okay.
the information problem is a secondary issue. If you can't get to the physical process, then the information issue is not even an issue.
Well, I go back to the book by Charles Faxon and others that talked about the probability of forming by random processes from a mix of amino acids, proteins, for example. And they came up with like 1 part in 10 to the 78th power or something like that. So basically that little, hey, that's not likely to happen anytime in the entire universe. So the probabilities of reactions taking place, just physical reactions, what's the probability of anything significant happening? Almost zero. But when you combine that with the fact that it also has to produce meaningful information, the probability reduces to zero, because information has never been shown to be generated from random processes.
Just to answer your question, Ron, I just wrote a paper explaining why origin science today is pseudoscience. In other words, if you look at the origins of the universe, look at the origins of first life, look at the origins of complex life, and just to pick on the first life, you have 3 things. One is Pasteur proved in 1864 that abiogenesis does not work. You can't get life from non-life. No scientist would disagree with that. Second, all the experiments that have been done, including the Miller's experiment, requires intelligence to do in the first place. You can't do it randomly. And none of them have shown that it's possible to make life from non-living material. Third, look at the mathematical probability of the complexity of any simple living organism. It is such a small number that you can't do it. So those 3 things kill the whole origin of first life argument. And if you can't get that, you can't even start evolution, right? And the origin of the universe, well, that's all assumptions based on other assumptions. There's no science behind it. So science kills all those 3 origins. I just wrote a paper, submitted to Creation Conference in Ukraine. I'm going to circulate that paper for anybody that's interested. It's on my website.
So there must be a
But- but-
disconnect here somewhere in the science, because my astronomy professor last class, he said, evolution of life is easy. Are they not listening, are they not, they're not?
He's not even reading papers by his colleagues.
No.
Let's say it's impossible.
Right, so I
Never
was
had.
dumbfounded. And the
Never had.
professor I gave you was a distinguished member of the Academy of Sciences, who telling me that life does not break down in water, amino acids. You know, I mean, he says, I'm asking you the question, so they're not listening.
Yeah.
Pass the class.
He's got to read his own and colleagues' papers.
Related to these, just focusing on the chemistry alone again,
Okay.
not even
Okay.
dealing with
Okay.
information, which
Okay.
just, life is made of long chains of molecules, right?
Right.
Whether it's proteins or nucleic acids, it's long chains.
Right.
And so, is there any chemistry that allows those kind of chains of those kind of lengths?
Oh,
to
yeah.
Spontaneously,
Polyethylene, for example, can be of in an indefinite length, but it has no information in it.
but does it spontaneously form itself?
Yeah,
Yeah,
you
but not in water.
can, well, you can mix the appropriate things and create long chains of ethylene molecules that hydrolyze and form long, but those are non-informational chains. It's a polypeptide. Polypeptides are easy to form, but they have no information in them. They're totally useless to life.
But then don't those long chains want to break down almost immediately?
Not
Start
necessarily,
wanting to break
depending on,
apart?
depending on.
Like in the presence of water, for example, many other
Well,
things?
not necessarily. They can form pretty resistant to, most of them are hydrophobic. They tend to stay away from water. Basically, water runs off. Like polyethylene,
Well, polyethylene is a different chemical from protein,
Well, and
It's all the same.
there are all kinds of.
but that doesn't make any difference.
Basically, you can have long chains of polypeptides, but they have no information in them, and they're completely different. What makes it different in the polypeptides of life is that there's no relationship between one position and the next in the polypeptide link. That it has information that is contained in there, and that requires contingency, that you can make it something other than what it is. In polyethylene, polypropylene, there is no contingency.
It's a repeating
It's just a repeat
cycle, yeah.
of and basically the reason it has no information is that you could say, for example, in polyethylene, it's a CH2-CH, an infinite number of those in a row until you get to the end. No information, very low information. So
The proteins and nucleic acids are.
they're information rich because
Yeah.
there's no nothing about one position says what the next position should be.
Okay, so for those two kinds of chemicals, is it possible for those to spontaneously start making themselves
No, it isn't.
chemically? Is it
Because chemically, well, let me clarify that just a little bit. Some of the calculations that have been done saying that theoretically you could have a chain of random events causing a random polypeptide that happened to match the pattern of a DNA or a protein or something like that. But the probability of it is so low that basically it rules it out.
Well, suppose you've got a first life. Tell us about the probability of having a life that can reproduce itself. John von Neumann says that's an order of magnitude more difficult.
Oh, yeah, and the probability by even like Morowitz, he's a secular atheist as far as I know, calculated the probability of the generation of the first living organism or cell would be 1 in 10 to the minus 340,000, which basically says it can't happen. But evolutionists would say, well, the probability isn't zero, so therefore it could happen.
Yeah, we're here.
We're here, so it must have happened. Yeah. The whole argument is that since we're here and obviously we couldn't have just poofed into existence, therefore there had to be an evolutionary chain to get us here. That makes sense?
No. Anyway,
Other questions?
shall we conclude here? All right, well, thank you very much.